Hey, what's going on guys? Tim here, and today we're going to be continuing our looping series. I'm actually really excited about this one because this loop was submitted to me over on Instagram by Boy Sangor, and he hit me up with this one that he found on Pinterest, and I thought it had a really cool look to it and it'd be fun to recreate it. He asked me how we could do this in After Effects, and of course my curiosity piqued and I was like, I wonder if I could do this one, and sure enough, we made it work. So I wanted to share this process with you and show you how I accomplished this result by looking at this example that he sent me. I think the result was really cool. I'm excited to dive into this one and show you how we accomplished this. And I want to say, if you have any loops that you'd like me to try to recreate and kind of show you how you make it, hit me up over on Instagram or email me from my YouTube profile. And I'd love to see what we can do there and keep creating these videos. So as always, we're in After Effects, default layout, no third-party plugins. That's how we do this here. So let's go ahead and open up AE and let's jump in. All right, we are over here in After Effects, and again, I want to say thank you to Boy Sangor for submitting this loop idea. I'm excited to walk through this with you guys. I think we'll learn some things that we haven't yet and find some different ways to do things. So thank you all for following along. I've been loving all the comments, all the messages I've been getting on Instagram, over here on YouTube, and just being able to talk with you all and see what you guys are working on too. So let's jump in on this. So I'm gonna pull up this video that he submitted again, just so we can take a look at it. It's kind of low quality because it was taken off of the thumbnail on Instagram that he sent me in my messages. But if I play through this, you can kind of see we have lots of movement. We almost have this like glossy liquid look, and I really love how it looks like it's just kind of flowing or dripping its way down. So we are going to make this perfectly loopable, but we're going to match this as best as we can right here in After Effects. So let's get going on this. I'll probably jump back and reference this as we go along, but that is right here, and I will include this in the project files as well. So I have my default layout here, and let's create a new composition. I'm going to name this one Base. For a base animation, 1920 by 1080, and we'll keep this at 30 frames per second. And on my duration, I am going to make this just 10 seconds long. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And so we have our base comp made. The first thing I'm going to do is create a black solid. So I'm going to right click in my timeline here and go to New Solid, and I'm going to come down and change the color to black if it isn't already for you. And I'm going to hit make comp size just to make sure that it's the same as my composition size. So 1920 by 1080 is what we want. Let's hit OK. And this is a pretty simple effect we're going to base this off of. So let's go over to our effects and presets with our black solid one selected. I'm going to type in fractal noise, and it'll pull up right here. We have fractal noise. I'm going to double click on that and bring that over here. So let's change a bunch of these settings to get a look we want. On our fractal type, I'm going to go from basic to max. And on noise type, I'm going to change this to linear. And let's check the invert box and invert these colors here. On contrast, I'm going to go 120 and brightness -25. The overflow, we'll keep that the same. And let's go ahead and twirl down transform. And our first thing is this rotation. I'm going to change this to 45 degrees. And uniform scaling, let's check that off. And so now we have our width and height sliders independent, and so we can adjust those both in their own right. So scale width, let's go to 400. And scale height, we're going to crank this way up to 2500. And so you can kind of see we're stretching this vertically. So we're going to get that flow up and down here. Next is this offset turbulence, and this is where we're going to get some of our movement here. So we have our X and Y axis here, and we're going to play with our Y axis because we want to go up and down, north and south here. So with our playhead at 0 frames 0 seconds down in our timeline, let's hit that stopwatch next to offset turbulence, and 960 by 540, that's the default. That's where we want to start this. And so we have our stopwatch active at the beginning here, 0 frames 0 seconds. I'm going to take my playhead all the way to the end to that 10-second mark. And we're going to leave the X at 960, but on the Y, let's change this to 7,000. And so if I scrub through this, I'm just going to play a little bit. you can see we're getting that movement that's going north to south here, kind of the same as that flow. If I jump back over to this, you can see that, you know, we have this going from north to south here. So I'm going to come back over to my composition, take my playhead back to 0 frames 0 seconds, and come back to my effect controls up here. And let's change some more values here. So the complexity, we'll keep that at 6. And I'm going to go ahead and twirl up my transform right here just to keep this nice and clean. Let's twirl down our sub settings. And on our sub influence, I'm going to change this to 75. And our sub scaling, I'm going to change that to 50. And that's really all we need to do here. So I'm going to twirl up my sub settings. And let's add some evolution to this. We're going to animate this just a bit. So 0 frames 0 seconds, playhead, I'm going to hit that stopwatch next to evolution. And I'm going to take my playhead to 10 seconds, last frame. And on my revolutions, not my degrees, but my revolutions right here, I'm going to go 5 times. And we're going to go 360 degrees 5 times. Just to add some more variation, you see we get that kind of shimmer or flow effect right here. And that's going to serve us well in the end results. And as always, let's come back to our effect controls, twirl down evolution options and cycle evolution just to make sure that's looping, even though this is not a perfect loop from that offset turbulence, but we're going to fix that in the next comp. And that's all we have for our fractal noise. So I'm going to twirl up evolution and twirl up my fractal noise, and we're actually going to add one more effect here right underneath this fractal noise. So I'm going to come over to my effects and presets and type in fast box blur. Double click on that, and that's going to get added right underneath my fractal noise here. And let's change our blur radius to 15, and the rest of this is fine. So all we're doing is killing some of that sharp detail, and so we get a little bit more smooth movement in here. If I turn that off, you can see we've really taking this sharpness out of a lot of those edges here. So let's move on to our next comp. So I'm going to come back to my project panel here and come to my create new composition icon right here. And I'm going to name this loop. And so we're going to fix our loop in this comp here. Same settings, 10 seconds long, make sure of that, and hit OK. And so we have our blank loop composition here. I'm going to come to my project panel, grab my base comp, click and drag that into my loop here. And if you watched the last tutorial, we are using the same technique that we used in that one, but we'll walk through it here again. So I'm not going to make you go and watch that one. I'll explain it through this again. So we have our base layer selected here in our timeline. The first thing I'm going to do is hit Command D and Command D. So I want 3 copies of this. I'm going to hide this first one. And so we just have these 2. And we need to find the middle of this timeline. So I know my composition is 10 seconds long, so the middle would be 5 seconds right here. So I'm going to take my playhead to 5 seconds. And on my bottom base layer here, I'm going to click on that. I'm going to hit Option or Alt and right bracket. And then I'm going to click on that second base layer and hit Option or Alt left bracket. And so I'm going to trim that right to the middle on the other side. So let's grab that second base layer. I'm going to click and hold Shift and drag that to the beginning. And just making sure that it's right at the beginning here, I'm going to take my playhead to the start of this composition and hit my plus sign a couple times just to zoom in and make sure that that is right at the beginning there. So that looks good. Hit my minus sign to zoom back out of my timeline. And let's take that bottom base layer that we trimmed and take that all the way to the end, holding Shift. And I'll come back over, kind of zoom in here, make sure that's at the end, and that looks good. And so if I play the end to the beginning here, you can see now we have a seamless loop throughout this thing. The problem is right in the middle here, we have a jump where the beginning and end was originally cut. And so all we're going to do is cover that up with this top base layer here. So let's take our playhead to 2 seconds and 25 frames. So kind of scrub through and find that. You can see we're at 2 seconds, 25 frames right here. And same thing, Alt or Option, left bracket. And then I'm going to take my playhead to about 6 seconds and 25 frames. And I'm going to go Alt or Option and right bracket. And so what's nice about this is that since this is such a flowing movement here, it's not going to be too hard to cover up. So Let's come over into my timeline area and unhide this top base layer. And so if I play through this, obviously we're jumping from this bottom one to this top one and back out. So with my base layer selected right here on the top, I'm going to twirl that down and twirl down transform. And all we're going to do is play with this opacity here. So with my playhead right at the beginning of that 2 second and 25 frame mark where we have that cut, I'm going to hit that stopwatch on the opacity and I'm going to change that to 0%. And let's take our playhead to about 4 seconds and 15 frames. And I'm going to turn that to 100%. Let's take our playhead, let's bring this off. Let's take our playhead to 5 seconds and 15 frames. And I'm going to come over here in my transform options. And you see this little add keyframe icon here. I'm going to click that little diamond. And that just adds another keyframe at 100% opacity. And then let's take our playhead to the end of this cut layer, this top cut layer here. And that would be at the 625 mark. And let's change our opacity to 0%. So we have 4 keyframes, 0, 100, 100, 0. And let me play through this. And you can see how this works now. So we hit that opacity coming on and then coming back off. Looks pretty seamless. And we're going to hit that end and come back to the beginning. And that looks good. Seamless loop. Easy as that. And that's all we got to do to get that effect. So now that we have our loop comp set up, we can go ahead with our FX. So in our project panel here, I'm going to hit that new comp icon again. And let's name this one FX. Same settings as we've been using. Let's hit OK. And in my project panel, I'm going to grab that loop comp and drag that into my empty FX comp. So right off the bat, I'm going to create 3 adjustment layers to start giving this thing some depth. So in my timeline area, I'm going to right click new adjustment layer, right click new adjustment layer, and one more. And I'm going to name these according to the effect as we usually do. So adjustment layer 3, this top one, I'm going to name that plastic. Adjustment layer 2, blobby. Yeah, let's name it that, blobby. And the bottom one here, I'm going to name this caustics. So let's start with the caustics. I'm going to grab my adjustment layer there that's labeled that and come up to my effects and presets and type in caustics. And you see it pull up right there, and making sure that my adjustment layer is selected, I'm going to double click that. And let's go ahead and start running through these values. So on this bottom option here, I'm going to change this from caustics to loop. And on the scaling, let's leave that at 1. Reflected, that looks good. And honestly, this all looks good right off the bat. So I'm going to twirl up bottom. On the water, let's change water surface to loop. And we got some more definition here, which is nice. On the wave height, I'm going to change this to 0.150. On the smoothing, let's change this to 12. The water depth, 0.510. The refractive index, let's actually keep that 1.2. And on the surface color, I'm going to select that color box there, and the default is blue. I'm just going to change this to black just to take that color out, because we're going to color this thing later on. So let's hit OK with that. And surface opacity, let's bump that up to 0.5. And the caustic strength, I'm just going to bump that a little bit to 0.01. And that looks good. I'm going to twirl up water, and let's play with the sky here. So let's select loop instead of none. And on the scaling, let's drop this to 0.680. The repeat mode, reflected, and center looks good. Intensity, let's drop this down. So let's drop this to 0.08. And the convergence, that looks good at 0.2. So this is great. I'm going to twirl up sky. I'm going to twirl down lighting. And we'll keep that at distance source here. On the light intensity, I'm going to change this to 0.11. And the light color, that can stay white. The light height is 1, and ambient light, that looks good. So I'm going to twirl up lighting, twirl down material. And looking at this, the only thing I want to change is this highlight sharpness. So I'm going to click on that and change this to 28.5. So we're all done with our caustics here. So let's twirl that up and move on to our blobby layer. So I'm going to click on my blobby adjustment layer, come over to my effects and presets, and type in blobby. And that should pull up the CC Blobalize here. So making sure that adjustment layer is selected, I'm going to double click on that. And let's go ahead and change a couple of these settings here. So I'm going to twirl down blobbiness. My blob layer, let's change that to loop. The property, I'm going to keep that at lightness. And the softness, let's change that to 50. And the cutaway, I'm going to change that to 0. I don't want to cut any of that away. Let's twirl up blobbiness, twirl down light, and we're going to use the effect light that's built in here, so that will stay the same. On the intensity, let's change that to 200. The color, that can stay white. Distant light is fine. On the light height, let's change this to 87. And the light direction, we'll keep that at -45. So let's twirl up light. And on the shading, this will all stay the same. So nothing we have to do there. This looks good right now. So let's twirl up shading. I'm going to come back to my timeline and select my plastic adjustment layer. And as you probably guessed, we're going to come over to Effects and Presets and type in plastic. And that'll pull up CC Plastic. So making sure that adjustment layer is selected, let's double click. And I'm going to twirl down surface bump here. And on the bump layer, let's change that to loop, and luminance is fine. On the softness, let's change this to 35.9. The height, I'm going to bump this all the way up to 99. And the cut, min and max, we'll just leave that at 0 and 1 because we just want to keep this all on the screen again. So let's twirl up surface bump, twirl down light, and we're going to use the effect light again. The only thing I'm going to change on this is the light height. I'm just going to bump that up a little bit to 70 just to kind of bring out the speculars more. And that's all we need to do there. And the shading, I think that all looks good too, so nothing we need to change there. So let's play through this. You can kind of see we're getting that liquidy, syrupy effect here. And if I pull up that reference video, I'm going to play through, we're kind of getting that same effect here. So we're going to go ahead with the next steps here and our last comp and get this thing colored and out the door. So come back to my composition, and on my project panel here, I'm going to find that new comp icon. And let's name this one render. For our render comp, same settings, nothing should have changed. Let's hit OK. And in my project panel, I'm going to find that FX comp and drag that into my empty render comp. So the first thing I'm going to do on this FX comp is come over to my effects and presets and type in displacement. And that should pull up displacement map. Let's double click on that, and this is going directly on this FX comp. And we're going to come back to this. I just want to make sure this effect was on here. And the next thing we're going to do, we're going to create the map for this displacement map. I'm going to come over to my project panel and my reference video here. And if I play through this, you can see we kind of have some almost sharper edges here, or maybe some square looks to this. It's not as blobby and free-flowing. It almost looks like it's in columns here a little bit. So we want to achieve that effect through this displacement map. So I'm going to show you how I did this. I'm going to come back to my composition, because if I play through this, you can see it's very like free-flowing, not a lot of definition or form to it. So I'm going to bring that back to the beginning. And all I'm going to do with this displacement map is come down to my timeline, right-click, New, and Shape Layer. And we're going to use a shape layer with a gradient to achieve this effect. So I'm going to twirl down Shape Layer and go to Add, Rectangle, and then Add Gradient Fill. And let's twirl down Rectangle Path 1, and I'm going to unlink the X and Y here so that we don't constrain our proportions. And on my X, I'm going to type in 1920, and on my Y, 1080, just so we fill the whole screen here. And that's all we need to do on our rectangle path, so let's twirl that up. Let's twirl down our Gradient Fill, and we're going to keep this at linear. On our start point, I'm going to change the X to -560, and the Y can stay the same. And then on the end point, I'm going to change this to 684, and the Y can stay the same on that. And what we're going to do is create some gradient stops within it. So let's click on the Edit Gradient right here in Colors and bring up our Gradient Editor. And all we're going to use is black and white throughout this whole thing, but we're just going to create multiple stops for it. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a stop right next to this white one, and we're going to add about 10 stops in between here. So just try to space them out accordingly and as best you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just try to follow along with kind of what I'm doing here. So pretty close to this white stop right at the beginning. I'm going to click there right underneath the gradient. You can see how I did that. And I'm going to change that stop to black. I'm going to go ahead a little more, change that stop to white. Next, another black one, and then a white. I'm going to go black again. And you can kind of see what I'm doing here. Kind of a pattern to this. And once we have all those made, we can kind of space this out as best as we can here. So this looks pretty good. Like I said, this doesn't have to be perfect, but just kind of make it where it looks like this. So we're cycling between black and white here. So this looks good, kind of have that striped look. Let's hit OK. And that's all we really need to do on the shape layer that we're using for the map. So I'm going to twirl up my shape layer and I'm going to rename this to map. I'm actually going to hide this layer because we don't need to see it on the screen. It's just going to affect this FX comp here. So I'm going to come back down to my FX comp and click on that and go up to my effect controls. And now that we have our map created, I'm going to change my displacement map layer from FX to map. And we can keep this at red. On my horizontal displacement, I'm going to change that to 100. And on my vertical displacement, I'm going to change that to 50. And this looks good. So you can see we're kind of cutting off the screen here. But all I'm going to do to fix that, I'm not going to do anything crazy. I'm going to zoom out here. And I'm going to come down to my FX comp here, twirl down transform. And on my scale here, I have my constraint proportions link. I'm going to unlink that. And I'm just going to scale up the Y a bunch, maybe to about 350. That looks pretty good. So if I play through that, you can kind of see the effect we're getting now. We have those columns. We have that kind of sharp edge look to it. That looks great. Honestly, I may just bump this up to 400 just for safety. Yep, that looks good. So let's twirl up our FX comp. And really quickly, let's finish this thing out. So I'm going to zoom back into my comp here. And I'm going to create 3 adjustment layers. So in my timeline area, I'm going to right-click, New Adjustment Layer, right-click, New Adjustment Layer, and one more. This top one, I'm going to name this CC for our color correction. The second one, name that PT because we're going to use that as posterized time. And this third one, I'm going to name this Mosaic. And this Mosaic one, this was kind of a preference that I did. I think I'm going to come back to this reference video, and I think because the quality was so low from the thumbnail that was sent, it kind of gave it this low resolution look where you kind of get these pixelated areas here. But I liked it, honestly. I thought it was a really cool addition to this. If the original is like this or not, I don't know. But I was like, let's just create this thing as close as we can. So I'm going to come back to my composition. And on this Mosaic adjustment layer, I'm going to come over to my effects and presets, making sure that that one's selected. I'm going to type in Mosaic. I'm going to double click on that. You can see we just kind of pixelated this thing out. Very unrecognizable. I'm going to click Sharp Colors. And on the horizontal blocks, let's change that to 300. And the vertical blocks, I'm going to change that to 200. And we're kind of back in, but we have a better pixelated look here, which is nice. So that's all we need to do with the Mosaic. I'm going to select my PT adjustment layer in my timeline. Come over to my effects and presets and type in posterize, and that should bring up our posterized time. I'm going to double click that, making sure my PT adjustment layer is selected. And all I'm going to do is drop this to 15. And so if I play through this, you can see we're kind of stuttering the movement a little. If I go back to that reference, kind of have that same look there, kind of a stuttered little movement. So getting as close to that as we can. And then on our CC adjustment layer, let's just color this thing and get it to where it needs to be. So we're going to add 2 effects to this. In my effects and presets, with my CC layer selected, I'm going to type in toner and bring up CC toner. I'm going to double click on that. And let's change this from tritone to pentone because I want to use all 5 colors here. And I'm going to run through these color values here. I'm going to click that color box, change that from white on the highlights to 7FA39F. On the brights, click that color box. I'm going to go 495F5B. Hit OK. On the midtones, I'm going to go 1A2322. Hit OK. On the dark tones, I'm going to go 181E1E. Hit OK. And so if I come back to that reference video, you can see we're kind of bringing in that green teal look to it. But obviously we're still missing a lot of those shadows and those deep tones there. And all we're going to do is fix that with some levels here. So let's come to our effects and presets. I'm going to type in levels. And there's a few options here, but I just want to use the plain old levels here. I'm going to double click on that and it should drop right underneath my toner. And on these values here on my input black, I'm going to change that to 25 to bring in a lot more of that black. We can keep the white at 255. On the gamma, I'm going to drop this to 0.87. And the output black, that can stay 0, and then 255 is fine on that. So if I bring these two side by side here, kind of scrub through, play through that one, we'll play through this one. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I can honestly maybe bring the scale down a bit more, so I'm going to come to my effects and go back to my scale and maybe take this down to like 250. Might have stretched that out a bit too far. Might even bring that down to 150. Yeah, that honestly looks a lot better. About 150 looks good. We could probably maybe turn that down a little more just to bring in a lot more of that definition, but I don't know. What do you guys think of this? I mean, I think it got pretty close, especially to the reference video here that Boysungor sent me. I think this looks pretty good. Man, thank you guys for following along. This was a lot of fun. I had a blast recreating this. Like I said, if you have any ideas or see a loop that you're like, oh, I wonder if we could do that, and I'd love to see a tutorial on it, I would love to take a stab at it. So again, I'll probably always try to use stock plugins and effects and the default layout, but I think most of the time we're going to be able to achieve a result at least very close to it just with default After Effects. So this was a cool one. I love the look of it. I don't know what to call it, so I'm just going to call it Boysungor's loop. And man, thank you so much for sending that in. And if you guys want to find the project files to this loop, to this project, or to past projects, go to my website, radloops.com. You can find a bunch there. I also just released a free texture asset pack just to say thank you guys for following along. Many more of those to come. You can also find me over on Instagram at Timmy Dwyer. I've been really enjoying getting to meet you guys over there, seeing what you guys are working on, kind of talking with you, getting to know you, and even doing this kind of stuff, answering some questions, helping you guys on projects and everything. So that stuff is a lot of fun to me, so let's keep that going. Thank you guys for subscribing, for liking this video. That means the world to me. I'm so glad you found value in this and are finding values in these projects and loops. And there are many more to come. I'm excited about the future with this. But until then, I will see you on the next one, and you all have the best day.